You open the fridge, there's nothing there. So what's it gonna be? Greasy pizza? Sad drive-thru burgers? Dish by Blue Apron is for nights like that. These are the pre-made meals of your dreams. At least 20 grams of protein, no artificial flavors or colors, no chopping, no cleanup, no guilt. Keep the flavor, ditch the subscription. Get 20% off your first 2 orders with code APRON20. Terms and conditions apply. Visit blueapron.com/terms for more.
You ever hear a story that makes you wonder if maybe we're not the only clever things walking these woods? Sometimes the shadows hold more than shadows, and sometimes the thing you're sure you saw might just see you back. This is the story about a man, a hidden valley, and 6 days that changed what he thought he knew about the world. Welcome back to Paranormal Directive 13. Welcome back, everyone, to Paranormal Directive 13, your weekly paranormal podcast, where every week, me, your host, Matt, takes you through another paranormal case and unravels the stories, the people who lived them, and the weird questions they leave behind. You know how most Bigfoot stories go. A shadow on a trail, a footprint the size of your boot, maybe a knock on a tree that makes you zip your tent all the way up and pretend you don't hear it. But this one doesn't end in the shadows. This man didn't just see Bigfoot, he claimed he lived with them. 6 days, deep in the coastal mountains of British Columbia. Carried off from his camp and held captive by what he swore was an entire family of wild giants. If it's true, it's the most intimate Bigfoot encounter we've ever told. If it's not, it's one hell of a story for a man to stick to until the day he died. This is the story of Albert Ostman, the man who was kidnapped by Bigfoot. So let's roll it back. It's 1924 in Vancouver, British Columbia. Albert Ostman was a construction worker by trade, but he was a prospector at heart. The kind of man who could spend weeks alone where the trail disappears, just a rifle, a pack, and a rumor about gold. He'd come over from Sweden as a young man with that old world grit, that made him feel right at home where civilization stops and the timberline starts. And there was this rumor about an abandoned mine at the head of Toba Inlet, which is like this deep fjord that sliced nearly 40 miles inland. It had these steep granite walls on either side, and the edges were thick with these cedar trees so old that they looked like they'd been standing guard there for like centuries. And around the docks, people told him about this old white prospector who used to vanish around there. He would come back with gold in his pockets, drink himself stupid in saloons, and then disappear back out into the bush again. Until one day, he just didn't come back at all. And when someone finally found his cabin, it was empty, just a bedroll and some scattered tools and a half-finished journal entry that ended mid-sentence. Locals whispered the mountain giants got him. The local seashell people called them Saskets, wild people of the forest. Not animals, not quite human, but something older, living where the ridges stay hidden up in the clouds. So Albert hired a native guide from the Seashell Nation to run him up to the inlet by boat. The old man wasn't thrilled. He had watched the sky like he expected trouble, even when the sun was shining. And as they loaded their gear, he told Albert they are not animals, they are people, big people living in the mountains. He said his uncle once found tracks by a salmon stream that were 2 feet long, and toes clear as day in the mud. And before they pushed off, the guide's wife came down to the dock. She said something in Seashell, which was just sounded sharp and worried. And Albert didn't know the words, but he knew a warning when he heard it. And he just kind of laughed. He tapped his rifle. Who needs legends when you've got 30 rounds and a tin of snuff in your pocket? He paid the guide to come back in 3 weeks. By then, he'd either be rich or ready to go home empty-handed. So they dropped him at the head of the inlet on a gray morning in late July. The guide shoved off without a word, and Albert felt that thrill, the wide-open forest in front of him like a book nobody's read yet. But under that thrill, something else. This feeling that the woods were watching him back. And if you've never stood in an old-growth British Columbia forest, it's not just trees. It's like this living cathedral. There's Doug firs and red cedars 300 feet tall, trunks so wide that 5 men couldn't wrap arms around them. And there's just moss draped everywhere like curtains. The air is heavy with wet cedar and salt drifting in from the ocean. And at night, you can't even see the stars behind that black canopy of trees. And if you can see any light at all, it's this ghostly green glowing fungus on the fallen logs. It really just sounds like this spectacular sight and place to go visit. And for days, Albert bushwhacked his way through the ridges, splashed through crystal clear lakes that you could count the pebbles at the bottom of them. And he was looking for quartz veins, which was nature's signpost for gold. And this land was young and angry. There was twisted rocks cracked just right to hide precious metal if you knew where to look. And he made his camp under 2 massive cedars by a stream that kind of sang him to sleep every night. And for a while, it was paradise. Until he woke up one morning and found his flour gone. An entire sack just vanished. No mess, no bear claw rips, no tracks, just gone, like it had kind of grown legs and walked. And Albert was familiar with bears. They tear things apart. They're not sneaky. And whatever this was, it was careful. So he rigged up an alarm. Pots and pans stacked so they would clatter if anything big brushed against them. And the next morning, the alarm was untouched. But his bacon was gone. 3 days later, his canned peaches were gone. It was always neat, and it was always gone. So, getting real tired of this and kind of thinking maybe there was someone else out there with him, he loaded his rifle, crawled into his bag, boots and all, ready to spring up at the first snap of a twig. But the deep forest has its own kind of lullaby, and he couldn't fight the sleep forever.
We all prefer things a certain way, like groceries. If you want groceries just how you like them, you gotta try Instacart. They have a new preference picker that lets you pick how ripe or unripe you want your bananas. Shoppers can see your preferences upfront, helping guide their choices. Because when it comes to groceries, the details matter. Instacart. Get groceries just how you like.
He woke up to a feeling that didn't fit any dream. Kind of like he was drifting, floating. No ground under him. He was moving. Wrapped up tight in his sleeping bag, lifted like a rolled rug under a giant's arm. And every step he felt through the canvas, a rhythm too heavy for any man and too steady for any animal. Above him, he could hear breathing, deep and low, and a cough now and then like old leather clearing its throat. And the smell hit him too. It's not rotten or rank, but just kind of wild, like wet fur, pine sap, and like a timber floor. And for 3 hours, they moved through the dark. He'd glimpse stars when the trees broke overhead, but they didn't help. The canopy swallowed him up faster than he could count. And when they finally stopped, he hit the ground like a sack of grain, just cold rock. And the sky was starting to turn gray as the sun was slowly starting to rise, and he heard voices, 4 of them, and this weird chatter that sounded more like a conversation than a growl. So Albert clawed his way out of the bag, his joints stiff from being trapped in there for 3 hours, his hands locked around his rifle, and saw what was waiting for him. 4 figures, a whole family. The old male was every bit of 8 feet tall, shoulders so wide they looked carved from driftwood logs, his big barrel chest and deep-set eyes that glimmered with something sharp, something thinking. And the face wasn't quite ape, but it wasn't quite man either. A flat nose, a heavy brow, a jaw like an anvil. And beside him was the adult female or the matriarch of this little family. Shorter but stocky, big hips, hair falling over her forehead like rough-cut bangs, and her eyes flicked from Albert to the smaller ones, part curious, part what in God's name have you dragged home? And the young ones, they peeked from the brush. The boy was already 6 foot plus. He was kind of gangly with bright eyes, and the girl was smaller, almost delicate looking by comparison, but her stare was intense, like she was trying to read Albert's mind from 30 feet away. And they didn't charge, they didn't roar, they just studied him. The old male gestured, big hands carving shapes in the air, muttering in that rolling chatter, and the female snapped something back, and the kids whispered to each other wide-eyed. It was almost like they were having this conversation of the father brought this guy home, and the mother is in there, what the hell did you bring home? What are you doing? And he's trying to explain this whole big plan that he has for bringing this man home. It's like if your kids brought home a puppy, and you're like, what are we going to do with this puppy? And they're like, look, I got this great idea. And that's kind of the vibe you get from this conversation between these two adult Bigfoots. And Albert turned himself in a slow circle, and he was in this kind of hidden bowl, maybe 10 acres across, cliffs all around, with thick brush filling in the gaps, except for one narrow pass. And standing square in front of it was the large male, who was essentially a living wall. And the days passed like a dream half remembered. Morning mist would just pool in the hollow, and the creek would just kind of gently flow through the middle of the clearing every morning, and you could just hear the sound of this gently running water over the stones. And the air smelled kind of just green, like crushed grass, wet wood, and the musk of something wild that didn't really belong in any zoo. And he rationed what was left of his cans, the stuff that he had with him in his pack. His coffee became kind of a ritual. He'd take tiny spoonfuls and stretch them across days. He tried a fire once to really kind of heat up the coffee and brew it properly, but he put it out pretty quickly, worrying that the smoke might bring some sort of trouble or concern from his captors. And the family of these creatures just settled into their own routines. The old male would circle around the brush, sniff the wind. The woman gathered piles of roots and ferns and berries, just kind of sorting them like a camp cook. And the kids were just kind of like kids, they chased each other up cliff faces, they would wrestle with each other. Sometimes they'd just vanish for hours, coming back, with this kind of laughing secret chatter that they had. And every time Albert would drift near the pass, the old male rose, not aggressive, just there. It's kind of like an unspoken, not today, not yet. And it was the old woman who cracked first. And one morning she brought a bundle of roots that were actually kind of sweet when they were broken open. They were these grass stalks that tasted faintly of sugar and berries that stained his lips purple. She laid them out near his bedroll, stepped back, had her arms crossed like she was grading him. So he nibbled on the roots and gave her a little smile, and she made a low sound, not quite a purr, not a grunt, but more kind of like just kind of an approval sound. And the boy watched it all with just these wide eyes. He crept close when Albert would carve scraps of wood, his eyes locked on the little tools a human made from nothing. And one day, Albert made a dipper from a leftover tin, which a dipper is just like a little tool you can use to just kind of scoop up water out of a stream. He split the rim, whittled a branch into a handle, and pressed it tight. And he tossed it over to the boy. The kid just kind of turned it over, sniffed it, and trotted it straight back to the old man, just chattering like he'd just won a prize. And the next day, he came up to Albert, pointed at the dipper, then at his sister, and then back at Albert. It's kind of a universal sign for, hey, make another one for my sister. So he did. And he showed them how it worked. He showed them how to scoop the creek water with it. He took a long sip, kind of smacked his lips, and the boy almost smiled, or at least as close as 7 feet of the shaggy curiosity can get to grin. But the nights were the worst. Albert would lie awake staring at the moonlit cliff, wondering how far the boat was now. 20 miles, 30 miles. He wondered if his guide was back telling stories at the bar, hey, I told this fool not to go, and he decided to go anyways. His father used to tell stories back in Sweden of trolls in the forest, wild men at the edge of farms. The old places remember, he would say. Respect the woods. Albert, kind of wondered if his father would have called this madness or just nodded like he'd seen it coming. And he barely slept. Every creak in the brush made him grip his rifle tighter. But he couldn't shoot his way out. One bullet wouldn't stop that wall at the pass. And worse, it might turn them against him. Because up to this point, he wasn't being treated poorly. They were not aggressive. They were not violent. They were just not letting him leave. They were feeding him. They were looking at him and taking interest in what he was doing. So he wasn't necessarily feeling super threatened, but he also wasn't allowed to leave. And he didn't want to disrupt that by firing a gun and escalating it into something much worse than what he was currently at. Especially knowing that his gun was most likely not powerful enough to really do much damage to any of these things. But by the 5th day, he was starting to get a little anxious. He kept thinking to himself, I can't stay here forever. I got to get out of here some way or another. And he remembered something that his grandfather told him, which was a story about a farmer tricking a mad bull with snuff. He blew the nicotine in the eyes and it disoriented it long enough for him to slip away. And Albert had brought 6 cans of snuff with him, and he turned the one can over in his hand, kind of looking at it like it was his magic charm, because the old male had constantly been sniffing at his gear every chance he got. So when the boy crept close, Albert offered a taste of it on his fingertip. The kid licked it, spat it out so fast he nearly choked, and ran squealing over to the adult. And the old man sniffed him and then locked eyes with Albert and just gave him this look that said, "I don't know what that is, but I'm going to find out." And on the 6th morning, the plan came together. Albert brewed coffee so strong it smelled like heaven and bad ideas. He packed a fat pinch of snuff in his lip, smacked it out loud, and the old male perked up, sniffing at the air like a bear on a honey trail. Albert cracked open the tin, pretending to scoop out another taste, but he didn't get the chance. This giant hand swooped in, grabbed the whole tin, and dumped it down his throat like it was maple syrup. At first, there was nothing. Then the blinking, his eyes were watering, and then this low moan like an old barn door swinging open. He grabbed the coffee pot and gulped the whole thing down in 3 sips, burning his throat on top of the nicotine. And he started squealing almost like a pig, staggering over for the stream, hacking and drooling. And Albert didn't wait. He grabbed his pack, shouldered his rifle, and sprinted for that doorway. The woman roared when she saw him, a rumble that kind of rattled stone loose from the cliffs, and he fired a shot over her head, and it cracked off of the stone, and it echoed through the valley like thunder. She froze, and that was the window Albert needed to get out of there. He ran until his legs gave out, up ridges, down gullies, every heartbeat screaming, "Don't look back." He climbed up this high ridgeline to see if they were coming. Nothing. And he thought to himself, "I'm going to go up high because if they're coming after me, they have to come up this hill too, and I can at least get a few shots at them before they make it up here." But nothing. Maybe they stayed to tend to the male's new tobacco problem, or maybe they're just letting him go. And he stumbled his way through the woods, keeping the sun to his right side to try to have any sort of direction of where he was going. And hours later, he heard the rumble of a diesel engine. It was a logging camp, and he stumbled out of the brush just looking exactly like the wild men that all these stories were about. Filthy, ripped up, rifle in his hand like a trophy. And to these loggers, he was just another prospector who'd gone mad. He told them he had gotten lost, and he waved off any questions, not telling them what he had just experienced. Because, 1, who's going to believe him? And 2, some stories need to sit a while before you say them out loud. And by the next day, Albert was back on a boat to Vancouver, carrying a tale that he wouldn't share for 30 more years. And part of me wonders, did he ever tell the guide that he was back? Because the guide was supposed to come get him in 3 weeks. He had only been up there about a week and then spent 6 days with the Bigfoots. So now we're at 2 weeks and he's heading back to Vancouver already. So did he ever tell them that he was back? Or did this guy show up there a week later looking around like, well, where the hell is this guy? Is he coming? Is he not here? Is he dead? What's going on? That part of the story is never told. And it's something that I thought was pretty funny I'm pretty sure he probably never told the guy. And he didn't say a word about this to anyone at first. Not in the camps, not at the bars. It was really, like we said, who would believe it? Bigfoot wasn't even a thing yet. It was just this folklore of stories people told when the night was quiet, and just, the wild man stories. 3 decades later, when the paper started printing wild man sightings, Albert finally stepped forward. He didn't write a book, he didn't charge for interviews, he just told it. Exactly the same every time, even under oath. Now, John Green, a journalist who dug deep into Bigfoot lore, called him very believable. But Dr. John Napier, a primatologist, wasn't so sure. He said that he fails to convince him. How does a man vanish for 6 days with these giants and come back with no proof? Sweet grass and berries cannot feed an 8-foot giant, let alone a hostage prospector, let alone there was 4 of them, not even just 1. But here's the thing. Albert described details that nobody was really talking about back then. The sagittal crest, the foot anatomy, the family structure, stuff that only really primate nerds knew in the 1920s. Coincidence? Lucky guess? Or maybe something he really saw. But then also, in that point, where people point this out, he also waited 30 years to tell the story, And a lot of these details were things that were a little more common knowledge in the 1950s than they were in the 1920s when this apparently happened. So it's possible he heard this and added it to his story to increase the believability. And folklorists, they say he just mirrored old myths. The Saskats from local tribes, the Skogsmen from Sweden, the European wild man. But others say maybe that's the point, that these stories echo because something real inspired them in the first place. And these folklore stories, the treasure guardian legend is as old as can be. A wild man guarding gold in the mountains, snatching prospectors who get too close. It's a myth that shows up everywhere. From, as we mentioned, Sweden to the local tribes, to Europe's woodwoes, to the Yetis of the Himalayas. It's a very common story. So was Ostman retelling an ancient story, or did he live it? Or did he blur the lines so well that we're still arguing about it a century later? Albert stuck to his story and took it to the grave. He never got rich off it, he never changed his tune, just told it over and over like he needed someone to carry it when he was gone. No proof, no hair samples, no bones, just this single thread in a big tangled web that keeps the wilderness just wild enough to wonder about. So, did he live with Bigfoot, or did he just dream it all up when he was out on a prospecting trip? I personally believe Bigfoot is real. I think he is out there. He terrified me as a kid. I saw this movie about Bigfoot, and I don't remember the name of it. It was a documentary movie when I was like 8 years old, and it scared the shit out of me. And I have been terrified of Bigfoot ever since. That being said, every time I'm out in the woods, I am out there looking for Bigfoot. So I want this story to be true. I want to believe this story. It scares the crap out of me about the thought of getting kidnapped by Bigfoot and living with him for 6 days. But it is such a cool story and such an interesting tale that it's something that I personally want to be true. So that is the story of Albert Ostman being kidnapped by Bigfoot. Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode. I hope you liked it. I've been wanting to do a Bigfoot episode for a while. And if you follow along on the TikTok, you will see that Bigfoot himself was recently pretty upset that we hadn't done Bigfoot yet. So I felt that we had to get one out there for him. And I'm glad it lined up so well. And this is such a fun Bigfoot story. It's more exciting and fun than, say, the Patterson-Gimlin story, which we will get to later because that's a huge episode in itself and kind of the main Bigfoot lore tape out there. So we'll get into that. But this was, I think, a great introductory Bigfoot story, a crazy story of someone being kidnapped by Bigfoot, and this story that has no proof but still lives on to this day. So if you guys like the episode, please go on whatever podcast app that you use to listen to this. Give us a rating, leave a review. It's huge for growing the podcast and helping us reach new audiences and keep growing. And share the show. Please share the show. That is the main thing that I ask of anyone to do. That would be the most important thing. If you want to help grow the show and get this out there to more people, just share this with everybody that you know. Click the share button, put it on your Facebook, your TikTok, your YouTube, your Instagram, whatever you want to do, and just share it with everyone. It would be huge, and I would be so appreciative to everyone who does that. And also, while you're at it, check out the Patreon, patreon.com/paranormaldirective13. We got the weekly minisodes on there. We got pictures of all these different stories and everything. And it's just another place to get some extra episodes, bonus content that is not put out on the main podcast. So through there, there's eight or nine mini episodes on there right now. So you'll basically almost double the amount of episodes that you have to listen to right now. And that's where we go into some of the more fun ones and just the stuff that, a lot of the stuff that we know isn't true, like the creepypastas, but also stuff that's worth talking about and is interesting, but just not quite fitting for a main podcast episode. And if you're interested, here's a clip of the latest minisode so you can get a taste of what that's like. Some people swear that PepsiCo is run by the same shadowy elite that wants to clue you in, but only if you're paying attention. Don't believe it? Well, let's line up the evidence. First is Maui Burst. It's sweet, it's tropical, pineapple flavored. Sounds great, right? Not really. I don't really like pineapple, but a lot of people do. Anyways, In August 2023, wildfires ripped through Maui, one of the worst the island had ever seen. Entire communities were gone. People were displaced overnight. Then someone pointed out, hey, didn't Mountain Dew drop a flavor called Maui Burst not too long ago? What if it was a clue, or worse, a sign it was planned? Some people even took it further. DEW, D-E-W, must stand for directed energy weapons, secret lasers from outer space that are setting these fires on purpose. So that pineapple soda, not quite so sweet after all. So that was the most recent mini episode about the Mountain Dew flavor conspiracy, which, as you can tell, is not big enough to be a full episode, but still definitely crazy enough that we need to talk about it. Also, guys, follow the social medias, TikTok, YouTube, Instagram, all at Paranormal Directive 13. And also, if you have any questions, you have any comments, you have any stories you want me to look at, send me an email, paranormaldirective13@gmail.com. Thank you guys so much. Tune in next week for the next paranormal tale. And remember, if you're going gold prospecting and someone starts stealing your stuff out of your camp at night, don't be surprised if you wake up the next day surrounded by a family of Bigfoot.